Hello.
Hello, police.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track to go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Tucker had given him control of a couple of clubs, but the profits from those would take time to arrive. The sensible thing to do was to pull out of the deal and wait. But Tate wasn't about to start being sensible. In fact, since getting out of prison, he had been getting increasingly out of control and paranoid. He began to fear that he was being left behind by Tucker and Rolfe. The two of them had killed Whittaker in his absence and had set up profitable deals of their own. Tucker, in particular with his house, cars and horses, seemed to be raking it in. Even Rolfe was doing well, having paid £80,000 cash for Tucker's old attached house in Chafford 100. And while Tucker had offered Tate a place in his organisation, Tate knew this was more down to friendship than anything else. Tate wanted to prove himself every bit as good as the others, and the money he could make out of the deal with Steele could be a great start. So rather than wait and miss out, Tate decided to take advantage of the friendships he had made in prison, where he had become great pals with the likes of a well-known cop killer, 2 brothers from an Essex family known as the Joneses, whose names have been changed, who always had plenty of ready cash knocking about, and Ronnie Knight. The Joneses are the sort of villains whom even hardened members of the criminal underworld go out of their way to avoid. Totally ruthless, fearless and efficient, the fact that few people have heard of them or their dominance of towns like Romford is testament to the power they wield. When Tate approached them, he made an offer they simply wouldn't be able to resist. Basically, if they lent him £40,000 for 2 weeks, he'd give them £50,000 back, guaranteed. No one wants to look a gift horse in the mouth. The answer had to be yes. Hands were shaken, the money was duly handed over, and that was that. Tate was back in business. The parties continued, and so did the drug binges. Everyone goes a bit crazy when they get out of prison, living life to the fullest and all that. But Tate was taking it to the limit, and then some. It got to the stage where Tate himself was no longer calling the tune. The drugs were. Halfway through his official getting out bash at a snooker hall in Dagenham, a few days after the deal with Steele had been struck, Tate ran out of cocaine. He decided that he needed more, and knowing he had plenty stashed near his home, he asked one of the guests to drive him over to his place. The man had been drinking heavily and knew he was in no fit state to be behind the wheel of a car, so he refused. It was the wrong answer. Tate pulled the man to one side and pulled a gun on him. "Get in your fucking car and drive me back to my fucking house, otherwise I'll kill you." The man reluctantly agreed. Half an hour or so later, mission accomplished. The pair returned to the party. Tate got out of the car and made his way back to the door, before noticing that the man who had just driven him home was following close behind. "Where the fuck do you think you're going?" said Tate. "You ain't coming back in here. Fuck off. Go on, fuck off or I'll shoot you." Sarah Saunders had been Pat Tate's lover for more than 6 years, but during all that time, the couple were only actually together for a year and a half. I saw a side of Pat that nobody else saw. I was really in love with him. He had a terrific personality, but he was always in prison. Sarah had been there when Tate had robbed a happy eater in Basildon. She had been there, along with his then wife, when he jumped the dock at Billericay Magistrates Court to make his bid for freedom. She had been there when he was captured and sentenced to 10 years for robbery and drugs offences. She had even been there when Tate had been shot for the first time. The pair had a son, conceived while Tate was on day release from Hollesley Bay, but despite Tate doting on his child and providing for Sarah whenever he was away, the strain of the separation eventually proved too much. When he got out of prison for the last time, we would just row a lot. He started taking lots more drugs and it was really affecting his personality. He wasn't the same bloke I'd fallen in love with. I hardly recognised him. Sarah had been wanting to leave for some time, but was too scared and felt she had nowhere to go. The situation continued to deteriorate and finally reached rock bottom soon after the Dagenham party. After a furious argument, Tate stormed out and told her that it was all over. She was no longer welcome in his house and had better not be there when he got back. In desperation, Sarah called the boyfriend of a close friend of hers who lived a few streets away. He turned up in his car and helped Sarah grab a few things and took her to stay with them that night. The following morning, there was only one person Sarah wanted to call: Mick Steele. While Tate had been in prison, the person he trusted most with his money was Michael Steele. Tate had put him in charge of around £23,000 and given him strict instructions to dish it out to Sarah as and when it was needed to pay bills or buy things for their child. The pair had got to know each other while Steele was in prison, and she had also become very pally with Jackie Street. As the months went by, so the friendship between Steele and Saunders developed. As soon as he heard the news about her being kicked out, Steele began to help her to set up a new home. Darren Nichols states, "I was trying my hand at running a business repairing and selling fridges and freezers. Mick called me up and asked me how much it would be to replace the fridge in Sarah's new house because the one she had wasn't working. Depending on how much it was, he was going to buy it for her, but he told me not to tell Jackie that he was paying for it, as she wouldn't like it if she thought he was spending their money on someone else. I told him it was best if I come round and have a look at it, because I might be able to get it working. Jackie Street picked me up in her RAV4 and we met Mick and we went over to Sarah's place. It didn't take long to work out what the problem was. The fridge had been plugged into the cooker socket, so every time Sarah turned off the cooker, she turned off the fridge as well. It was around lunchtime, and a couple of friends of Sarah's turned up to cheer her up with some bottles of wine, so we all sat about in the living room chatting about Pat. The whole conversation revolved around just how bad he was, how out of control he'd become, and how much he had changed. It turned out that when Pat found out that her friend's boyfriend was helping Sarah move out, he went completely mad. Even though he had actually told her to leave, he somehow blamed this bloke for splitting the two of them up. Along with Tucker and Rolfe, they went to track the bloke down. They basically kidnapped him off the streets and took him back to Pat's house, when they held a knife to his throat and told him to snort 6 lines of coke. He tried to say no, but they made it pretty obvious that if he didn't do as they said, they would hurt him really bad. So he started snorting, and they made him snort more and more and more, until basically the guy passed out. Once he was unconscious, they stripped all his clothes off and started putting out cigarettes all over his body until he came round. Then they made him snort more coke until he passed out, then they burned him again until he came round again. After a while, Tucker and Rolfe were getting bored and said they thought the bloke had had enough, but Tate wasn't having it. He was like a man possessed. He just kept waking the bloke up and making him snort more and more until eventually they ran out of drugs. Then Tate chucked the bloke in the boot of his car and dumped him in the front garden of his house. When the bloke's girlfriend came home, she found him rolling around naked in the living room, covered in burns and gasping for air. He'd had so much powder up his nostrils that he couldn't breathe through them. He had no idea what was going on or who he was. He was in a right old state, just crying constantly. They'd really broken him. He ended up in a psychiatric unit for 3 days, and when he got out, surprise, surprise, he decided not to press charges. Sarah was upset by the whole thing, but I was surprised to see that Mick was almost in tears himself. He kept saying that he just couldn't believe how someone he had once considered such a good friend had changed so much. He'd get more and more angry every time Sarah mentioned something new that Pat had done to her. He seemed to be taking it really personally. Eventually, he walked over to Sarah and gave her a big hug. It was a whole new side of him.